the book, The Lincoln Highway, as our February book club pick. And I couldn't be more pleased. It seems it's amazing that last month we hardly ever choose books that are written by men, but last month we chose the World Chess by Robert Giuliani, and now this month we have The Lincoln Highway with Amor Towles. So I'm so excited to welcome Amor Towles to join us this evening for the Girlfriend Book Club. Welcome.
Thanks, Shelley. It's good to be here.
And just a reminder to those that are watching, this is a 30-minute conversation. It goes quickly. Please post your comments and questions, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. And this is a free event, so if anybody's trying to charge you for it, it's a spammer. This is a free event, as always. So welcome. I'm so excited. First of all, I just want to know a little bit about your background. I saw you interviewed on the Today Show, and you talked about wanting to be a writer since you were age 7, I believe. And then there was something about a message in a bottle that went somewhere and came back. I just wondered if you could tell these fans of yours a little bit about your background.
My background. I grew up in the Boston area, and in Dedham, Massachusetts. And it is true that I've wanted to write since I was really in first grade. In first grade, my first grade teacher, Mrs. Gum, who I remember as being like 60, but she was probably 30. You know,
how do you remember your first grade teacher's name?
I remember, right? She made an impression on me. But she brought a friend of hers who was a poet who wrote for younger people named David McCord, who was quite well known in the Northeast as a juvenile poet. He read his poetry. We could buy his books at the end of the thing. I think I bought like several of them. And I went home, I just thought it was the greatest thing. And I read them quickly. And then I began writing poems like him. I was very excited about it. And then it kind of began the process, which was from that point forward, it was read, write, repeat. You know, so from my youth on, I would read something and get interested in the style of it or the approach. And that would sort of prompt me to experiment in my own writing in a different way. And then so I wrote in high school, I wrote in college, I wrote in graduate school. And it all came out of that, you know, Mrs. Gom, God bless her.
So did you have cousins, siblings, I mean, other people in your family that wrote like that? Or were you sort of an anomaly where everybody's like, why is he's a writer at age 7?
Yeah, no, one of the things that sort of along these lines is I did, when I was 12, I applied for the job of writing the gossip column in our local summer newspaper, you know, which was normally written by somebody who was, you know, a quite older, you know, person. Right. And someone had died, and the column hadn't been written for a year. And I was like, I'll do it, you know. So at the age of 12, that was my first paid writing gig. You know, I can't remember. I was paid like a quarter a line maybe or something like that. Maybe it was 12 cents a line. But I would write up, and, you know, you'd write about what was going on in the community and stuff like that. And then I got kind of bored with that. So then I would start making things up that were happening in the community that weren't happening in the community. And I started putting those. So that was sort of the beginning. But you know, I was doing more serious work soon after.
So what's to do with the message in the bottle that went out and came back to you?
Well, you can't go retelling that old story, really.
No, nobody know. I didn't know it till I saw it on the Today Show.
Good Lord. Yes, and it has nothing to do with me being a writer, by the way. But yes, when I was 8, I threw a note in a bottle into the ocean, and it was discovered by an editor of the New York Times, who then began corresponding with me, and we corresponded until I was 18. And then I went to New York for the first time and met him, and you know, he was a terrific gentleman.
I think that's pretty impressive. That's pretty amazing,
Thank
right? You. So your first book was Rules of Civility, which we know. And this book was so popular that it finally gave you sort of the license to quit your other job, your day job, which I think was in banking or finance.
In investment management, yes.
Yeah. And so go back in time. So you wanted to be a writer, but you didn't know if you could make a living at it, I guess. And so you went into this other career, but then you wrote the book in your 40s, I believe. And then that sort of gave you the license to finally pursue what you really wanted to do. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a way of putting it. I mean, when I moved to New York City at the age of 25, I was writing fiction full time, and I had some stories that were published in the Parish Review, but I felt a little claustrophobic. I felt a little frustrated, working by myself all day at the age of 25. I was broke. My father wasn't very happy. So I joined a friend of mine who had started an investment firm, and 21 years later, we were still working side by side. And that was a terrific career. I loved it. I loved our clients. I loved our craft. I loved our colleagues, my partners, and that firm is, thriving, bigger than ever. But it was in a way, it was my partner's dream, not my dream. And so yes, I began writing fiction I was writing fiction kind of in my spare time, and when Rules of Civility was published and became a bestseller, I just thought, it is time for me to go and do, what I've wanted to do since I was a kid. And,
right.
So everybody, was understood and was, gave me a pat on the back out the door. But yes, I've been a writer full time since then.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Did everybody give you a pat on the back? Was everybody kind of stunned that you were able to actually do this thing that you wanted to do? Or do they, or were they like, yeah, it's about time. Okay, we knew you were going to do this.
Well, no, you see, because nobody knew. Because we're in the cul-de-sacs of my life here. But I hope those listening or find this interesting. But at any rate, no, the nature of being an artist where you're not pursuing your art directly because you have another job is that you sort of talk about it less and less and less. And some of you who are on this communication may have had that experience. If you always wanted to be a painter and then suddenly you're teaching an English class, or you're a travel agent, or you're working in a kitchen, you don't introduce yourself as a writer or as a painter or as a musician, whatever it is, because because you're not doing it in a visible way. And so you feel a little guilty about that. You feel a little embarrassed about saying that's what you are, because it's not something that is a part of what other people recognize. And so it kind of becomes increasingly a private thing you're doing. So by the time Rules of Civility was finished, I submitted it, and it was sold at auction, almost none of the friends that I had made over 20 years in New York knew I wrote fiction at all. They thought of me as this guy, the guy who worked in an investment firm and had a wife and children and lived in the village. And, and that was who I was. And so it was quite surprising for everybody, including me, to have the book do so well. But it was a surprise pretty much across the board.
So I hope you had a big party when that happened, because that's quite amazing, actually.
I was sufficiently celebrated. Yes.
And so then, of course, was The Gentleman in Moscow, but I need to get to Lincoln Highway.
Yeah.
So lots of people have asked this in the book club. I mean, it's number one on the New York Times bestseller list. I mean, what inspired the Lincoln Highway? What was the impetus behind this idea? Because I personally had never thought about the Lincoln Highway, didn't know anything about the Lincoln Highway. And after I read this, I actually was looking, doing some research about it. I mean, what prompted that idea in your head?
Well, so let's start by saying that when I set out to write this book, I had never heard of the Lincoln Highway. So Lincoln Highway was not a starting point for me. For me, I usually start with a premise, a little notion that strikes me, like, right. Guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. That was really, I had that idea, and that became A Gentleman in Moscow. Yeah. In the case of the Lincoln Highway, I think that those of you who've read it could guess in a way what it was, because it really began with this notion of, what if a kid who was sort of an honorable young man who did something bad and, had gone to juvenile, work farm or whatever to pay his debt to society, if he's being driven home by the warden and, brought to the family farm, ready to start his life fresh. And as the warden drives away, he discovers that two friends from this juvenile facility have hidden in the trunk of the warden's car. And suddenly, all of his plans for how he was going to start his new future go off the rails. That's the idea that came to me. And so you.
I don't even. How does that idea come to you? I'm kind of interested.
Sometimes it's triggered by something, like A Gentleman in Moscow. I was walking into a hotel when I had the notion. In this, I don't think it was triggered. It wasn't like I was walking out of a prison and had the idea. I don't remember what it was. It just sort of out of the blue, and that happens sometimes. But occasionally, and I have many things like this. But some of them really grab at me, and I'll dig deeper and deeper and deeper into, okay, well, what happened? What's he like? What are the guys in the trunk like? What do they want? What happened? What happened to the father? What's going on the farm? And when does it happen? And so, no, right away, I was like, oh, this is great. It'll be a story set in the 50s, and it'll take 10 days. And so then I designed it over a period of years, and then I outline it, and then I eventually write it over, more than a year. It's a multi, it takes me more than whatever it is, 5 years to even more than that to go from conception to a book that ends up in your hands. Now, I would say that I think that our particular audience here, I'm 57. I think that many of you would find this aspect of this interesting, which is that right from the beginning, my idea was, oh yeah, this will be a great story to set in the 50s. And so, and I kind of have reasons why, but not really very strong reasons why. It just felt right. And, this young man being driven home from the warden onto the family farm and then going off to New York City, it would be a great sort of period. Now, when I had finished the first draft, basically, I was really finishing the first draft. Not till then, it suddenly occurred to me, I bet it's about, for those who haven't read, I'm sorry, it's about 3 18-year-old boys and an 18-year-old young woman are the main characters. And there's an 8-year-old boy too, but most of the characters are about 18, 19 years old. And suddenly I was like, you know what? My dad was probably 18 around 1954. And I went back and checked, he passed away some years ago. And I was like, oh, yeah, he was exactly that age. And one of the things that immediately struck me is that all of us, are so highly influenced by the decade between the time we're 6 and we're 16.
Yeah.
Whatever the world is like between the age of 6 and 16 has great influence on us. And I mean that what's going on in the world culturally, economically, sociopolitically, that's a shaping decade for all of us. And it has repercussions right down through the decades as we age into old age, much as, my father was born in the late 30s. And so the Depression affected him, even though he barely saw the Depression. You know what I mean? Right up till the day he died, there was sort of a lingering sense of the Depression's influence on him. So this is true, in my opinion. But I think that we are almost as significantly influenced by the decade in which our parents became of age.
Right.
Our parents, between when our parents were 10 or 6 to 16, because that's what shaped them. And that's what shapes how they communicate to us. It's what, how they describe the world to us is influenced by that. How they describe what's right and wrong is influenced by that decade. How they see, whether they're pessimists or optimists to some degree, and whether they trust government or not, or all these various things, whether they think you should save every penny or splurge occasionally, is affected by that decade when they were young. So I think we know a lot more about the decade when our parents were young than we might think we do. And we certainly know more about that than, say, the decade in between, so if my father was young in the, late 40s and early 50s, I had in a way know more about that than I do about the early 60s.
Right.
Because it's sort of a gap between when he was young and when I was young. And so, in retrospect, I think that the book is very much influenced by my sensibility of that time period that I inherited through my parents. And so when I realized that the main character, Emmett, his birthday is mentioned in the book. So I went back and changed his birthday so that now his birthday is my father's birthday. December 12th, 1935. They were born on the same day, and that seems fitting to me.
Well, so I have a place in Montclair, New Jersey, which is just outside Manhattan. And I really love the way you described New York City. I'm going off script. I'm just going to say this. I love the way you described New York City in the 50s.
I can't hear you. I don't know if you froze or I froze. I hope it wasn't me.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. You froze for me there.
Yeah, and I think you froze for me too. Shoot. Can you see me or no? Shoot. Can you see me at all?
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I don't know which one of us are, but go ahead. You're good. Well, let's go right to it. Tell us about New York. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, I just wanted to know from you, I'll try to get back on screen. I'm sorry about that. But just, your thoughts about writing about the New York City in the 1950s. It seems so glamorous compared to New York City today. I just wanted to know, how it was to write about that time.
Well, no, it doesn't seem very I mean, you're nice to
Well,
say
it
that.
seemed glamorous when you wrote it in the book. It did.
Well, I mean, my first book, Rules of Civility, which is in 1938 New York, that's a glamorous book. There's a lot, there's champagne and jazz and wealthy people, and there's just for those who haven't read the Lincoln Highway yet, they do go to New York, but there's not a lot of glamour in it, so they do. But it was fun to revisit New York in a different decade from a different point of view, and for those of you who know New York and who have not read the okay. For those, what ended up being a central location is the High Line.
Daniela, is there something happening on the back end? I can hear that. Danielle? Okay. Can you hear me, Amor?
Yeah, very. Oh, there. Okay. Yeah, now. Okay. Wow. This is like an episode of Star Trek or something.
It is. Well, it's. Oh my God.
Shall I put yours on mute for 1 second, if you would?
Yeah, I will.
And I'll answer your question. I think we're getting an echo from you. For those of you who know New York today, there was this extraordinary thing in New York, which was that in sort of the history of Manhattan, which is now known as the High Line. And basically what happened is in the late 30s, a train track was built, which is elevated a story and a half above the street, which comes from Harlem down into lower New York. I mean, close to 14th Street, almost all the way down to 14th. But it was elevated so that freight trains would not impede the activity of the pedestrians. And that some cases they went right through manufacturing buildings. So there'd be a hole in the building and the track would go right through the second floor of the building, and you drop off raw materials, pick up finished goods, and the train would keep going. But it was not a subway elevated, it was a freight elevated. Now, it just so happened they built this in the late 30s. So literally within like a decade and a half, it was almost obsolete because people weren't manufacturing in New York City anymore. So they needed it less and less and less, and it began to be abandoned by the 1950s. And in the 1960s, it was totally abandoned, but it wasn't taken down. And so it stayed in New York City, this track running, down the west side of Manhattan. And what happened is plants began to grow on it, homeless people or hobos would, live on it. And people would meet there to smoke pot or whatever, but it became this sort of weird space in the city that people would sort of would travel to or would wander onto and climb the fences to go see it. And eventually two peers of mine who were used to climbing up over the fence and checking it out and seeing how wild it was, and you have these incredible views of the Hudson River from it, heard that the city was going to tear it down. And they said, no, this should be a park. And they fought to have it a park, and they raised money for it, and eventually it became a park. And now it's one of the most famous parks in America. I mean, really, and around the world. People come all over the world to go walk the High Line, this park. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? I knew my characters were coming in, these young men. Two of them were going to be riding a freight train into the city. Two of them were coming by car. Two would be riding a freight train. I thought, how interesting for them to come and arrive on the High Line, what we now know as High Line, as it's still, let's say 2/3 of it is still working and 1/3 of it has been abandoned, the final bit. And so that when they get off of it in the company of another sort of, in essence, hobo or a rider of the rails, they find an encampment up here on the High Line in the high grass and, behind the wire fences in this abandoned track. So that is that's the New York that they visit. It's not the New York of martinis and jazz clubs. It is the sort of New York of sort of an offbeat, sort of rundown spot. Now, the other fun part about sort of reimagining New York for me, and again, having written about New York in the 30s to kind of revisit it, is that one of the main characters, Duchess, grew up in New York, and his father is basically a failed vaudevillian. He was a Shakespearean actor who didn't succeed, so he became a vaudevillian, doing Shakespearean monologues on the stage, but then he was a drinker, and then vaudeville collapses, and so he's sort of a post-vaudevillian. And he lives in New York surrounded with all these post-vaudevillian characters, a lot of whom are drinkers, none of them have much money, but who are all sort of elaborate, creative, fanciful people, escape artists, magicians, singers and dancers. And that's where Duchess grows up in. Emmett's growing up on a farm in the Midwest, Nebraska, was very practical and surrounded by sort of a religious and practical community. Duchess is growing up in this sort of wild New York that is defined by the end of vaudeville. Now, by the 1950s, of course, vaudeville is totally gone. But this is what he grew up in, was, again, sort of a little bit seedier, run down, but very colorful New York. And that was part of the fun of the story is to have these young Americans, Sally, Emmett, Duchess, and Willie, who were all the same age, but were raised in very different corners of America. And as a result, have very different personalities, different worldviews, different senses of what is right and wrong. And so while they are all quite friendly and moving together in concert, we get to see how these different upbringings express themselves to some degree through conflict and through contrast.
Yeah. So I think I read somewhere, I'm echoing still, sorry. Oh, God. I wanted to ask about you doing it from, instead of 2 points of view, Duchess and Emmett, doing it from like 8 or 10 points of view. That's what I was going to ask you about.
I got it. I got you. Okay, Shelley. It is true that when as I mentioned earlier, I design books over many years before I sit down, and then I outline them, and then I write them. And so it's a multi-year process. And when the outline was basically finished, and I was ready to write the book, and I had designed over a period of years, the concept was that it was 10 days. It was always a 10-day story for me. And it would go back and forth every day. We'd hear Emmett's perspective on day one, and then we'd hear Duchess, his perspective on day one. Duchess being the kid from New York who was hiding in the trunk of the warden's car. It was a bit of a troublemaker. And it would go back and forth across the 10 days in this way. Maybe some days you'd hear from both of them twice, but it would alternate. But as I began writing in earnest, began really crafting the first chapter, what became clear to me was that, for instance, when Emmett comes home, his younger brother Billy has been taken care of by his neighbor, a young woman who, he is a peer of his. They may have been romantically involved as teenagers, named Sally, who's an extremely practical, sort of Midwestern, her mother has died, and so she's taking care of the house for her father, somewhat reluctantly, and with sort of strong opinions about it. And she's a religious person, but she's got strong opinions about that too. At any rate, they interact on the first day, and you get a glimpse as the reader of what Sally is like. But what I kind of knew, even as I was finishing Emmett's chapter, where her interaction with him is described, is that the reader is not really getting a sense of who Sally is. And I knew who she was. And I thought she was a great personality. And I thought that she saw the times in a way that Emmett would never understand to look at the times. As a young woman who's being has to run the household for her widowed father, and in this time before feminism, and just on the verge of feminism in America. And so knowing her personality and knowing her circumstance, I really suddenly realized we got to hear from her. So there should be a chapter in which we hear from Sally. And I was having the same feeling about Wooly. Wooly's this wonderful character who grew up in New York, in wealthy New York. And he's sort of a lost young man. His father died in the Second World War, and there's been generational wealth, but the family is kind of sort of broken apart a little bit. And he's sort of dropped out of one boarding school and another, and he's sort of at loss in the world. And I loved his personality, the way he sees things. But again, you get a very small glimpse of him when you see him from Emmett or Duchess's perspective. You get a sense of him, but you don't really know him. And again, I felt like we have to hear from him, so the reader gets to really know how he sees the world. And so I found and of course, once you take the lid off, then there's just no going back. So instead of having this book where it was two people going back and forth, suddenly I had 8 perspectives over the 10 days. And I rapidly redesigned the book. So it's the same events and it's the same sequence of events. It's just that instead of it going back and forth, you get to hear new voices step in and fill in what's happening that day, but from a different angle. And we keep moving forward. And I think hopefully it's a much richer experience for the reader by virtue of this. And I, at this point, could not imagine it being a story told from two perspectives at all.
Am I echoing? I hope not.
No, you're better now.
So before we finish, I mean, I just have to say that this book, not only did it give you these rich main characters, but it also gave you a bunch of rich side characters, whether it's Sister Agnes or the mechanics at the auto shop or whatever. I mean, how much fun was it to come up with those people? Did that come, like you said, you kind of have an outline, you know what you're going to do, but did that kind of come later as you were going through the book? Did you add those people in, because they were such rich characters in and of themselves, you know?
Yeah, it's an astute question, because I think what happens is when I'm designing, you're right that if you look at the first draft of any of my books, Gentleman Moscow, Rules, or Lincoln Highway, the four central characters, let's say roughly, are fully realized in the first draft, and in fact probably too realized.
Right.
They get too much space, they say too much, they do too much, we hear too much from them. And what happens in the revision process for me is very often a very important part of the revision process is I find myself wanting to know more from the secondary or even tertiary characters who, and I realize I haven't really given them their due. You know, I want to know more about them. You know, you're going to want to know about them, and they should have more time to make their point of view heard. And so very often what I'm doing in draft 2 and 3 is carving back the pages of the central characters and elaborating the experiences of the side characters. And, you know, I think like Abacus's chapter, it certainly wasn't in the original design or even the second design.
Really, that was like one of my favorite. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I love it. Was a late entry.
Yeah.
And that's one of the great things about the revision process is everything's laid out, so you can make very small changes at that point, introducing a small chapter that can resonate and in a way punch above its weight because it's tied into all the things that are happening around it.
Right.
A few pages can have a lot of impact if they're dealing with something that has not been yet addressed. And that's always one of my favorite parts of both the editing process and of the book. In the end, I always love those parts in a way more than the original, the original core that makes the whole thing possible.
Yeah. So I only have like a couple minutes, but I just have to say, I love Sally. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri.
So did my dad.
Actually, a little town outside St. Louis called Washington, Missouri. So Sally reminded me of every person I ever knew in Missouri. And I just loved her. I don't know if there was somebody that inspired her for you, but to me personally, I thought she was great. And Billy, I just love Billy so much. I think that was my other favorite character. And then just, trying to show Emmett at age 18. I mean, I have 3 kids around that age, myself. So that was really interesting to me, showing, an 18-year-old with his whole life ahead of him, and something happens to him, and what's he going to do next? And, you're looking at your future and you're thinking about everything, what's right, what's wrong. I thought that was just absolutely fascinating. So
yeah, it's interesting. I didn't anticipate this, but the book can, as it continues to be on the New York Times bestseller list now, several months later, and thank you readers and thank you booksellers and librarians everywhere. But I appreciate your enthusiasm for the work. One of the reasons I think that's happened, and I didn't really anticipate this, is that the moment in time is so universal. The moment of being 18 and I know we're out of time, but so I'll just say it as quickly as possible, is that for all of us, when we're 0 to 16, we're receiving information and guidance. We receive guidance from our parents, from the church, from the community, from our teachers, and like they're shaping us, right? Yeah. That's what it's all about. They're telling us all these things so we know what's right and wrong and how we should act and how we should treat others and what the world is like and what to expect from the world and ourselves. That's all being communicated by these constituencies. But around 17, 18, or 19, it's when we realize, wait a second, I'm in charge of all this.
Right.
I can decide who I am,
Yeah.
what's right and wrong, who I should spend my time with, what I'm capable of. And that's a very exciting moment in our lives. And that's what, even though the story is 10 days, it's at the moment when these four central characters really are beginning to explore that, to take everything they've been told from the past, from these various groups, and to reconsider it and start to decide on their own how they want to lead their lives and who they think they are and what they are capable of.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we've all been through. And so it's been interesting to see, even though this is a book about 18-year-olds, the 50-year-old reader, the 60-year-old reader, the 70-year-old reader, the 30-year-old reader come to it and recognize that moment in time for themselves, Yeah.
But, so this book, I'm sorry, it took place over 10 days. Gentleman in Moscow, I think, was 30 years. I mean, was it more difficult to do this book spanning 10 days or spanning the 30 years in Gentleman in Moscow?
It's easier in the sense that you're covering less ground, but it's harder in the sense that it's hard. You don't get the chance to depict the evolution of your characters. When you tell a 30-year story, what it is a story about evolution, about how the main character ages, how his or her viewpoint changes, how the friendships evolve, how a flirtation becomes a romance, how a babysitting job becomes parenthood, how a short-term job becomes camaraderie. These are the evolutions of a Gentleman in Moscow.
Right.
And meanwhile, the country's evolving around them.
Yeah.
When you tell a 10-day story, you don't have the freedom built into the storytelling to describe those evolutions. So the challenge is, how do you introduce into the 10 days glimpses of the past for these characters and glimpses of the future too, in a way, so that the readers can get a sense of the implicit evolution, even though it's through this narrow aperture.
Yeah. So 2 more quick questions. So everybody wants to know, what are you working on now? What can we expect from you next?
What I can tell you is it's going to be different.
Okay.
And I can tell you, I'll tell you that it begins in Cairo in like 1940 and it ends in New York in 1999. But that's all.
Okay, we're going further. Okay, even more than the 30 years. Okay. And finally, I just have to ask you, I mean, when you're just on a personal level, when you're not writing, what are your favorite books of the past year? What have you been reading? Who are the authors that inspire you? Everybody always wants to know this sort of thing.
I'm 57, so I've been reading my whole life. So I'm inspired by many writers and different genres, different countries, and that's part of the great pleasure of being a writer at this age, is that you're drawing on not a single influence. You're drawing on a sea of influences. But I read with 3 friends. I've been in a book group for 18 years. We read by projects. So we'll pick an author, read 6 or 7 of his or her books in chronological order. We might take a theme and read 6 books tied to the theme, or a location, city, 6 books written about a city. And that's the way we work. We just launched, we're doing, I'm doing this, James Joyce. This is Dublin. We're going to do, I think 3 works by Joyce, and then we're going to do several other Irish writers. Over the course of a year, we'll read a variety of serious narrative written in Ireland. But I think Joyce will be the oldest of the group. And I got to say, having read Doublers as a younger person, it's amazing. And somebody wrote to me about this just yesterday. But we all, in a way, we've done disservice to James Joyce by lionizing Ulysses. For decades, is the greatest novel, the novel to end all novels, and the last novel, and the first novel, whatever. But it is a book which has, it's enormously challenging for, I have a graduate degree in literature. It's challenging. It is experimental. It is there's a lot of things that pose obstacles to even a well-read person to enter that narrative and feel like they're getting the best of it. And as a result, I think a lot of Americans they know that, or they sampled it and learned it. And so they're reluctant to read Joyce. But Dubliners, it's just a group of short stories, and they're not impenetrable. They're not obscure. They're not 600 pages long. And they're the most beautiful depictions of Dublin at the turn of the century, and just like the title says, of these various members of the city. You get glimpses of their life. Someone who's about to get married, or the person who's just lost their job, or the person who's run into an old friend who's become successful even though they're not. And they're just very beautifully done, and they're full of emotion and full of a sense of time and place. Anyway, so it's
okay. And when you're not reading and writing, what do you do for fun? Just last question. What do you like to do?
I like to cook. I do a lot of the cooking in my family. I love rock and roll.
Okay. So dancing and cooking.
Wife and kid.
Okay. So everybody, the Lincoln Highway, such a great read. I encourage everybody to get it. It surprised me. I did not know how much I would love this book, but it's one of my top reads of the past 5 years, I would say. I love it. So, and everybody that's in the Girlfriend Book Club, please stay on the website, stay on the Facebook page, because I'm going to be posting some conversation starters about the book so you guys can talk amongst yourselves. But thank you so much for joining us. It was such an honor, really.
And I should say, at amortowles.com, I write a lot of material about my books and post them there, collateral information or answers to typical questions. And, and you're welcome to go there also. That if it's not something we didn't cover today, it might be covered there.
That's great. Thank you very much. So thank you. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm sorry for the technical glitch in the middle of that. So
thank you, Shelley.
Anyway, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.